The Gödel Prize is awarded to outstanding papers in the area of theoretical computer science. It is jointly sponsored by the European Association for Theoretical Computer Science and ACM-SIGACT. The prize includes an award of $5,000 and is presented annually, with the presentation alternating between ICALP and STOC. To be eligible, a paper must have appeared in a refereed journal, and the initial publication of the results must have occurred within the 14 years before the award. This year's Gödel Prize is jointly awarded to Andrei Bulatov, Jin-Yi, Chen, Martin Dyer, and David Richerby for the papers The Complexity of Counting Constraint Satisfaction Problems by Andrei Bulatov, An Effective Dichotomy for the Counting Constraint Satisfaction Problem by Martin Dyer and David Richerby, and The Complexity of Counting CSP with Complex Weights by Jin-Yi and Chen. I would like to thank all of them. I know that you can't hear the roaring applause in the audience, but I'll try my best. And David Richerby will now tell us more about this amazing work.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone, to the committee for choosing us on behalf of all of us. We're incredibly grateful, and I, for one, was delighted and very, very surprised. Thank you also, Daniel, for the simulated audience reaction. That was much appreciated. Okay, so yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain a little bit about what this work was about, and where it fits into the big picture of things, and hopefully why it's interesting. Okay, so to start off, I just want to check, make sure that everyone knows what constraint satisfaction problems are. So the way that we're going to think about them is that we have some finite domain of values, and we're going to assign values from this domain to a collection of variables in a way that is subject to some specified constraints. And what these constraints do is the constraints are going to give us allowable combinations for values of combinations of these variables. And questions that we might want to ask include such things as, is it possible to satisfy all of these constraints, all of them at the same time? So this is the classical constraint satisfaction problem. Can you actually assign values to these variables from this domain in order to make all of the constraints true? Another question we can ask is, how many ways can we do that? So those are the counting CSP problems that are actually the body of work that we were all involved in. And I suppose I should mention here one additional direction that constraint satisfaction often goes in is, well, maybe you can't satisfy all of the constraints, but how many of them can you satisfy? So turn it into an optimization problem. And that actually turns out to be quite closely connected, but I'm not going to talk about any of that today. So here's an example. My domain here is just going to be the numbers 1, 2, and 3. My variables are w, x, y, and z. And I want to assign values from this domain, so values 1, 2, and 3, to these variables in a way that satisfies these constraints. Okay, so w and x are different, w and y are different, and all of the other ones that I've written down there. So as presented, this is kind of pretty abstract. If I give you a minute or two, I'm sure you can figure out a way of assigning those variables. And probably most of the time you'd spend would be just reading the constraints and trying to figure out what the pattern is. So here is the pattern. We have variables w, x, y, and z, and each line that I've drawn here is a disequality constraint. So there's an edge from w to x. So these now have to receive different values. There's an edge from W to Y corresponding to this constraint. And now you might have seen where this is going. Okay, I'm trying to assign values 1, 2, or 3 to each of these variables, which I've drawn as the vertices of a graph. And my constraints are that whenever there's an edge between two of these vertices, they must receive a different value from the domain. So all of this that I've been showing you is just an alternative presentation of three-colorability. So three-colorability, and indeed for any fixed k, k-colorability is an example of a constraint satisfaction problem. And this is by no means unusual. I didn't have to think for long before I found a natural example of a constraint satisfaction problem, because chances are, if you have a favorite problem, say in NP, that problem can probably be expressed as a constraint satisfaction problem. So things like satisfiability problems, scheduling problems, vertex covers, all kinds of those classical graph theoretical problems, all of these can be expressed very naturally as constraint satisfaction problems. I should maybe mention a couple of non-examples. If, for example, you are interested in things like reachability algorithms, perfect matchings, Hamiltonian cycles, things like this are not, in fact, constraint satisfaction problems. But a vast number of problems not only can be expressed as CSPs, but actually can be expressed very naturally as CSPs. So, complexity of these kinds of problems. So we've just seen that for any fixed k, the k-colorability problem is a CSP. So in particular, three-colorability is a CSP, and from that we can assume that if we view CSP as literally, here is a domain, here is a collection of variables, here is a collection of constraints relating to those variables, can you satisfy the constraints, then this problem is already NP complete. Okay, it includes three-colorability. It's clearly in NP because you can just guess an assignment to the variables and check. So this could very well be the end of the story, but of course you can tell that it isn't because we're only like 3 minutes into the movie. So how can we keep finding interesting problems here? So one thing that we could do is, instead of just allowing arbitrary constraints, what if we fix a specific set of relations? So for example, on the previous slide, I used disequality here. If I fix a specific set of relations, only allow myself to use those as constraints, and then ask, well, what's the complexity of these constraint satisfaction problems? And a bit of terminology, when we fix one of these sets of relations, we refer to that as a constraint language. So having fixed a constraint language, which traditionally we call gamma, then CSP gamma is, well, it's the constraint satisfaction only allowed to use constraints that are relations in that set gamma of relations over your domain. So k-colorability then is just the constraint satisfaction problem where you choose gamma to be the single relation which is disequality on a set of size k. Okay? So in particular, if you choose k equals 3, so gamma is just the disequality relation on a set of size 3, CSP of that gamma is NP complete. On the other hand, if we choose a different set of relations, so for example, the single relation which is disequality on a two-element domain, now that's just two-colorability, which we know to be in polynomial time. So if we start restricting what constraints we use, we can start asking questions about, hey, well, what's the resulting complexity of the system that we get. So everything I've said so far has been about sort of constraints in general. I want to move over now towards discussing counting problems a bit. So we're all familiar with, I hope, the complexity class NP. So NP is problems of the form, here's a non-deterministic polynomial time Turing machine. Does it have an accepting path or not when you give it a certain input? There is another class related to counting problems, known as number P or sharp P, where instead of asking for the existence of an accepting path of this Turing machine, we ask how many accepting paths there are. So formally speaking, number P is the class of all counting problems where you can get the answer by constructing a non-deterministic polynomial time Turing machine, and the answer to your input is how many accepting paths did that machine have. Counting problems are always going to be at least as hard as the decision version, right? So it's always going to be at least as hard to say how many three colorings does this graph have. That's got to be at least as hard as does it have any three colorings at all, right? Because if you can count, you can just ask, is that number you told me 1 or bigger? But actually counting can be a lot harder. So for example, 2SAT, the decision problem is in polynomial time, but number 2SAT, so how many solutions are there to this 2SAT formula, is actually number P complete. How hard is that? Well, it's kind of analogous to NP completeness in sort of the role that it plays in the theory, but actually it's very much harder. So number P complete problems are in fact hard for the whole of the polynomial hierarchy using randomized reductions. So these are some pretty hard problems. Nonetheless, we were able to give the following classification. So pick your favorite constraint language, so a collection of relations over some specified domain. The problem of counting solutions to constraint satisfaction problems using only those constraints from those relations for any set of relations is either doable in polynomial time or it's number P complete. Okay, so it's either relatively tractable or really, really, really super difficult. I've called it FP here for kind of technical reasons. FP is a set of function problems. P is just a set of yes/no questions. So a counting problem can't really be in P. But this FP is morally speaking, it's P. I should mention that the case where the domain was restricted to 2 elements had been known for a while. That's due to Cranio and Herman. And all of this work builds on a lot of papers by people like Catherine Greenhill, Martin Dyer, Andrei again, Martin Grohe, various work by people like Leslie Goldberg and so on. So there are a lot of names hidden in the background here. Something to mention about this dichotomy is that not only is it surprising because polynomial time and number P complete are just so far apart. It's also worth mentioning that if these two things are different, and we really hope they are, right? I mean, this theorem's a bit boring if FP and P are the same. Do we have to give the prize back if it turns out that P and FP are the same?
No, there's another prize for proving that.
Okay, right. Oh, but if somebody else proves it, then we have to give our prize to that. Damn. Okay. Man, this is dangerous. Okay, so yeah, if these two complexity classes are different, then actually there's this whole infinite hierarchy between them, which is essentially Ladner's theorem, but Ladner did it for P and NP. And another thing that's worth mentioning here is that there is in fact an algorithm that will tell you, given a constraint language gamma, does it lead to these easy cases that can be done in polynomial time, or does it lead to the difficult cases that are number p complete? So given a constraint language, you can actually figure out if it's going to be easy or hard. Okay. So you'll notice that two prize winners are not mentioned in here. So they're coming next. So the next part is weighted constraint satisfaction problems. I might as well deal with a quick question in the Q&A. Does the algorithm to separate the easy and hard cases run in polynomial time? No, actually, it is, I think it's NP complete. It's certainly in NP. And yeah, perhaps Martin can remind me, but I believe it's NP complete. Yeah, and we just had the same question again. Yeah. So yeah, I believe the algorithm that separates the two cases is NP complete, or rather the problem of separating. Okay, so weighted constraint satisfaction. What we're going to do is we're going to replace these sort of hard relational constraints of you must satisfy this constraint and this constraint and this constraint with what you might call soft constraints, so functional constraints, where instead of just allowing or disallowing certain combinations of values, you merely assign a cost to every possible combination. And in this case, we want to compute a thing called the partition function. I'm going to define the partition function through example. So suppose I've got these three constraints here. So these are just some functions f and g. You give them domain elements x and y, and they give you back a number. So some example constraints. The partition function then is the sum over every possible assignment to the variables of the product of the values given by all of the constraints on those variables. Okay, so take the first constraint, multiply by the second constraint, multiply by the third constraint, and add all of those values up for all of the different possible assignments. Okay, and relational constraints, the things that we talked about in the first half, these correspond exactly to functions mapping onto 0 and 1. Okay, so 0 would be a relational constraint that isn't satisfied, and 1 would be a constraint that is satisfied. So in that case, the partition function, well, each of these individual summands in the partition function is going to be 1 if all of the constraints are satisfied, and it's going to be 0 if at least one constraint is not satisfied. So in that case, the partition function is just the number of satisfying assignments to the original relational problem. And I'll give one example of a weighted constraint satisfaction problem, which is something that comes from theoretical physics, which has actually motivated a lot of the work in this area. So the domain here is just 0 and 1. We've got a 2-element domain. Excuse me. And our constraint function can return two possible values. One of them is a constant lambda that we'll choose and fix ahead of time, and the other one is 1. So if the inputs are the same, it returns the value 1. If the inputs are different, it returns this constant value lambda. So now, if I take a graph and I consider the edges of that graph to be my constraints, just like I did with three-colorability, but now I'm using a different constraint function. The partition function of this then is my variables are the vertices. My partition function is the sum over all assignments of domain elements, that's 0 or 1, to vertices in the graph, of the product of the constraint values. Well, the product of the constraint values is just for every edge, f of the value given to the variables. Okay, so if an edge receives both its endpoints get the same value, that'll give a weight of 1. If they both get different values, that'll give a weight of lambda. And this is what's called the Ising model of magnetism. What you need to imagine here is that the vertices of the graph are sort of atoms in a crystal or something. Each of them can be in one of two different states, which here I'm just going to call 0 and 1. And depending on whether neighbors in this crystal are in the same state or are in different states to each other, we get different values for the terms in the partition function. What we find then is that the value of this product essentially corresponds to the energy present in the system when the crystal is in this particular state. The partition function is the total energy of all possible states. So that becomes very useful as a normalizing factor if you want to sample these states with probability proportional to their energy, which is apparently a useful thing in physics. And the partition function actually tells physicists an awful lot more about the system. And so this is the extension that Jin-Yi and Xi made to the result that Andrei, Martin, and I produced. So now we've gone from not just a set of relations as our constraint language. Now our constraint language is a set of functions, and Jin-Yi and Xi basically decided to go big or go home, and they went big. So these are not just functions to, the rational numbers or something like that. No, these are functions to all complex valued functions. Well, okay, algebraic complex valued functions, but that's still essentially all. Still, even if you allow this massive increase in sort of range, if you like, we still have this dichotomy that everything is either computable in polynomial time or it's number p hard. Again, hard versus complete is just a little technicality here. Remember that I defined number p in terms of the number of accepting paths of a Turing machine, whereas the answer to these problems are complex numbers. So the problem isn't literally in number p, but it is number p hard. In this case, though, as far as I'm aware, there's still no known algorithm that will take a set of complex valued functions and tell you whether the constraint satisfaction problems based on those are easy or hard. And what I should also mention is that physicists do actually care about complex valued functions. This isn't just what's the biggest thing we can do? Let's do the complex numbers. Physicists care about complex zeros of partition functions and all kinds of things like that. So this is of some actual value. So yeah, that's where Jin-Yi and Xi took this. Then, well, what is these papers are a couple of years old now. What is the present and the future? So the present and the future, a lot of work on holants, which are a generalization of CSPs that do include things like perfect matchings. There's a lot of very interesting questions about restricted instances. What happened? Many problems become tractable on planar graphs, for example. And it turns out that, yes, you can actually start to classify problems into constraint satisfaction problems that are solvable in polynomial time, those that are solvable in polynomial time on planar inputs, but are number p complete on general inputs, and those which are number p complete or number p hard on all inputs, even if you restrict to planar inputs. So there's a lot of interesting work there. And finally, approximation algorithms. A lot of the I didn't tell you what the conditions are on these dichotomies. They're not crazy complicated, but they're relatively complicated. The sort of caricature version is that essentially these problems are in polynomial time if they're very special, and the vast majority of them are number p hard. So things like the Ising model are number p hard. So approximation algorithms there are currently playing a very, very important role. So I will stop there so as not to overrun, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. And once more, I'd like to congratulate the winners.